Give me 1 second. I've got to start the video. You are live already. Okay.
And in breaking news, an historical world event is happening just before Purim this year.
Okay, now. Okay, we're live there. Hope that works. Give it a sec. So what's happening in Israel? Do you know?
Seems like the ceasefire is holding at the moment. Yeah.
We have on Tuesday night, by the way, the director of Chabad of Victims of Terror is doing a webinar for us.
Huh.
So, good luck, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. And to Rabbi Karlebach, who intrigues us every single Matzah Shabbos. It's an absolute privilege. And if to speak about the importance of telling stories of the Rebbe and Tzaddikim on Matzah Shabbos brings bracha and peace to everybody who participates, in fact, to the entire world. We have an energy of godliness. So Yoshekoyach, and please God, b'schus this, we shall all be blessed with a good week and the ultimate bracha, the Yiskalas and Mashiach take it from Miyad.
Amen. Thank you once again, Rabbi Masinta, for giving me the schus, the opportunity of sharing stories of the Rebbe and Tzaddikim with you all, Mitzvah Shabbos, as we've discussed many times. In fact, I've just come off a Zoom of Jake Fine, Darren and Alana's son, Denise and Sali Seslansky's grandson's bar mitzvah. It was an amazing sight, and I'd like to wish them all mazel tov. Jake truly brings nachas wherever he goes and with all who know him. So I'd like to start with my story, a personal story that a Mr. Ovadia Eli tells. And I feel it has to do with what the situation in Israel, where we are praying for all our brothers and sisters there and worldwide with the spread, sadly, of anti-Semitism. And we hope that the ceasefire, that true peace truly descends upon the land of Israel, upon all the Jewish people, and in fact, the whole world. It is today in Parshas Nosai that we read the Birchas Kohanim, and the ultimate blessing of the Birchas Kohanim is V'yosem L'cha Shalom, that God should give us peace. There is no other people, there is no other nation, no other country that glorifies peace as much as the Jewish people in Israel do. And we know it is the ultimate and greatest blessing that Hashem has. And just a quick word on peace. Why is peace considered the greatest blessing of all? My cousin Shlomo points out that everything that we want to pray for, be it physical or spiritual, we could pray for selfishly. I can ask God to make me righteous, to make me holy, to help me become learned, to do all the Torah and mitzvahs, to give me even divine inspiration. On a spiritual point, I can ask God to give me every physical thing in the world, health, wealth, nachas from children, all that I can ask for myself. Peace is the one thing I cannot ask for selfishly. Because imagine if I'm riding in my quadraphonic speaker car listening to my favorite chazan, total peace. And I come home and rolling pins are flying, umeshreit, umekfitchet. How long is my peace going to last? There is no other nation in the world that wants peace as much as Israel. Sadly, it doesn't have it. Why? Because peace is not something that comes to one individual. It comes from such a high place in heaven that it either comes to everybody or it comes to nobody. And this is what we're praying for, that Mashiach should come and true peace should descend upon the whole world, as it says in the prophets, that Lo yisa goy el goy, cherev, no nation will raise a sword to another again, but true peace will come. May we see it speedily in our days. So this is the story that Ovadia Eli tells. He was a mayor in Afula, and there he became very close to the Chabad Shluchim in the city, Rabbi Chaim Sholem Siegel and Rabbi Shlomo Siegel. And he came to consider them as not only as his good friends, but also as his brothers. In 1991, the Afula City Council decided to present the Rebbe with a key to the city, a symbolic golden key in an elegant box, as token of appreciation for the important contribution that the Rebbe Shluchim were making to our city. Before we actually presented the key to the Rebbe, says Mr. Ovadia Eli, I began serving as a member of the Knesset, and I was appointed as the Deputy Minister of Defense, becoming responsible for the protection of Israel's home front. 2 months later, during Sukkot of 1991, I came to visit the Rebbe in New York with my wife, Ruti. We were there for a few days, and we were hosted by the Chabad Hasidim in Crown Heights. In the afternoon of Hoshana Rabbah, which coincided with Sunday that year, the Rebbe was distributing dollars, and I stood in line in order to hand him the ceremonial key to the city of Afula. The exchange I had with the Rebbe on this occasion made a deep impression upon me. Before I even managed to introduce myself, the Rebbe began to speak to me in great detail about the types of missiles which the enemy had and which might endanger the home front. I was astonished by the vast knowledge the Rebbe showed regarding the type of munition stockpiles that our enemies had and the dangers that may come from them. But then I was even more surprised by what the Rebbe said to me later on in the conversation. He said, as Deputy Minister of Defense of Israel, you are responsible not just for the well-being of the citizens living in Israel, but actually for the well-being of all Jews wherever they live in the entire world. I was impressed by what the Rebbe was telling me, that the defense system in Israel is in fact responsible for the safety of all Jews. That was a very broad, systematic view. It fascinated me. I became convinced that the Rebbe was right, that it is Israel's responsibility and duty to ensure the security of Jews everywhere. A few months after this meeting, on March 17th, 1992, the Israeli embassy in Buenos Aires, Argentina, was bombed. with 29 Nebuch Karbonis being killed and more than 240 people injured. As the Deputy Minister of Defense, I worked to arrange a rescue team to fly from Israel to Argentina, but it took more than a day to get it off the ground. I then recalled the Rebbe's holy words, and I decided to establish a permanent crew of emergency rescue forces, which would stand at the ready, able to fly out on short notice to rescue Jews wherever they may be, if chas v'sholem, a disaster like this should ever happen again. When this emergency rescue force was organized, I called it the Rebbe's Patrol for rescuing Jews around the world. Indeed, just 2 years later, on July 18th, 1994, there was another bombing attack against the Jewish community in Buenos Aires, Argentina's deadliest terrorist attack to date, resulting Nebuch in 85 people killed and hundreds more injured. Within a few hours, a plane with the rescue force was dispatched and went to work extracting people from the building which the bomb had collapsed. They were able to save several Jewish lives and did an incredible job for which they received praise and international recognition. I again realized the Rebbe's prophetic words and sage advice and how concerned he is for the entire world. Going back to my visit to the Rebbe during Simchas Torah of 1991, I have to say it was an extraordinary experience. I cannot describe what it feels like to walk into this huge shul, see thousands of people streaming in, hanging onto the walls, the poles, and the windows, as special trucks bring cool air into the hall that is filled to maximum capacity. To see the Rebbe encouraging the singing with his hand motions and the silence that falls when he is ready to speak. To feel the electrifying atmosphere, the tremendous, indescribable joy. All I could say is that anyone who was not at Simchas Torah with the Rebbe has never experienced true joy in his life. At the end of the holiday, I was present at the Kosher Bracha ceremony where the Rebbe distributed wine from his cup to the thousands that passed before him. I was the last person in the line. And you know what? That made me the last person in the world who received wine from the Rebbe's cup, as this was the last Kosher Bracha event that would take place. That end of Simchas Torah in 1991, because a few months later, on the 27th of the Hebrew month of Adar, 1992, the Rebbe suffered a stroke from which he never recovered. Beyond being a great Torah genius, the Rebbe was first and foremost a Jewish leader. He concerned himself with the preservation of the Jewish people, even in the most remote places in the world. Few are those who did as much as he ever did, even in the past 1,000 years of Jewish history. The Rebbe's contribution was obvious and important, and for that, he is much admired and loved. So tells Mr. Ovadia Eli. I would just like to add one line on that before we go to another story. And that is, we remember once reading that the Mizritcher Maggid said about his Rebbe, the Baal Shem Tov, had I not seen him with my own eyes, I would never believe that the Baal Shem Tov was a human being, a Yelud Isha born from a physical woman, for all that he managed to do. And that certainly applies to our Rebbe. The more one finds out about him, about his schedule, about his love, about his personal concern for each individual as well as Klal Yisrael and the entire world, it is hard to believe that a physical human being was able to accomplish as much and do what he was able to do. He was truly beyond nature totally. One of the important mitzvahs, one of the earliest mitzvah campaigns that the Rebbe ever came out with was the mitzvah of tefillin, going to all strangers in the world and asking them, are you Jewish? Put on tefillin. This was one of the geniuses of the Rebbe, in spite of opposition that he had towards it. And he explained that the Torah says, "V'ro kol amei haaretz ki shem Hashem nikra alecha v'yaru mimeka." The nations of the world will see that God's name is written upon you, and they will revere you, they will revere you. Elu tefillin shebarosh. This applies to the tefillin on our heads, and how tefillin literally protects not only ourselves, but we are all interconnected, every single person wherever they are. I'd encourage everyone, if you're not already doing it, put on tefillin tomorrow, protect another Jew. If you are already doing it, put on tefillin with somebody who is not doing it, as the Rebbe asked, and that will protect all of us. It is such an important thing to do. So I'd like to share with you what I found is a fascinating story about tefillin. And the story is told that the very famous tzaddik, the Rizhiner Rebbe, Rabbi Yisrael Friedman of Rizhin, was the son of Rab Shalom Shachna, who was the son of Rab Avram the Malach, they called him the angel. He was the son of the Maggid of Mezrich, who I just mentioned, and the Maggid of Mezrich, Rab Dov Ber, was also the Alter Rebbe's Rebbe. He was the disciple and successor of Rabbi Yisrael Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic movement. The Rizhiner, Rabbi Yisrael Rizhin, lived at the same time of the Tzemach Tzedek. He was a great, great holy man with open Ruach HaKodesh, and he was called Melech BeYisrael. He spoke about him coming from King David, and he glorified. He was truly a king in Israel. When the Rizhiner passed away, his heirs divided amongst themselves the inheritance. The Rizhiner, by the way, had 6 sons. They called the Rizhiner a Malach Elokim, an angel of God. A little boy came to the Rizhiner, and he was staring at him. And when they asked him, what are you staring at so much? He said, I was told that the Rishon is an angel of Hashem. An angel has 6 wings. So I'm looking for where are the 6 wings of this angel. When the Rishon heard that, he said, come, I'll show you. He took him to the bedroom where his 6 sons were sleeping. And he said, this are my 6 wings. So his sons divided the inheritance. The most precious thing that the tzaddik left was a pair of tefillin that had come down to him from generation to generation. In fact, they were his great-grandfather's tefillin, the Maggid of Mizrich. They were his tefillin. Each of the 6 sons wanted it. But David Moshe, one of the youngest sons, declared that if his brothers would let him have the tefillin, he would give up his entire share of the inheritance and leave it to them to divide the entire thing amongst themselves. That was not accepted, and they decided to cast lots as to who will get the tefillin. And guess what? As you may have guessed, it was David Moshe who was the happy winner. After all, I guess Hashem saw how much he wanted the tefillin, and the lottery came to him. 2 years later, Reb Avram Yaakov, the eldest son of the Rishner, and now a big Rebbe, he is known as the Sadegera Rebbe, he was sitting in the company of some of his many followers. It was Yutes Kislev, the 19th of Kislev. Chabad Hasidus knows, all Hasidim know that Yutes Kislev is the Rosh Hashanah of Hasidus because of the festival of liberation of the Alter Rebbe. But the Maggid had told him that Yutes Kislev will be both our Yom Tovs. Yutes Kislev is the anniversary, the yahrzeit of the Mizritcha Maggid, as well as the liberation of the Alter Rebbe, the Rosh Hashanah of Chassidus. So on Yutes Kislev, the yahrzeit of his great-grandfather Maggid, he was sitting with his Chassidim, and he mentioned how much he would have liked to have the tefillin that his father had inherited from his Zayda, the Mizritcha Maggid. But the younger brother, the saintly Rebbe David Moshe, was the happy winner. The Sadegera said, I have never envied anyone anything, but I must admit, I do envy my dear brother the unique privilege on putting on the sacred tefillin of our great-grandfather, the Mizritcha Maggid, every single day. 2 young Chassidim in the audience looked at each other meaningfully, and one of them rose and said in a trembling voice, Holy Rebbe, my friend and I wish to make a confession. We have done a dreadful thing, but not out of any evil intention. On the contrary, we wished to please our Rebbe. But then we realized we had done something very wrong. We don't know how to make amends, how to do teshuvah. And then, as everybody waited with bated breath, the young man continued, knowing how much our Rebbe had wanted his great-grandfather, the Mizritcha Maggid's tefillin, and believing that he was entitled to it, being the older brother. I'm afraid to say my friend and I sneaked in one day into Reb David Moshe's private room. We opened up the tefillin boxes housing the sacred parchments and took them out. In their place, we put in other kosher parshios, other kosher parchments of the tefillin, so they were 100% kosher. We sewed them up again and we left. But now, having done what we did, we have second thoughts and we realize we had done something dreadful. We didn't know what to do with the sacred parchments. We were afraid to return them, and we are afraid to give them to the Rebbe. But now that we heard again how much our Rebbe wanted to have the privilege of putting on the Mizritcha Magid, his great-grandfather's tefillin, we have decided to come out with it. And thereupon, the young man produced a small package and put it on the table in front of the Rebbe. All the Hasidim present were filled with awe and trembling, witnessing the extraordinary scene. How could these two young Hasidim do such a dreadful thing? They thought in disbelief. On the other hand, it also occurred to some of them that if the Tzaddik Reb David Moshe remained unaware of what had happened and continued to put on the tefillin as usual, surely this is a sign that the tefillin shouldn't really belong to him and he shouldn't be privileged to have them. All eyes were on the Sadegeret Rebbe as he carefully unwrapped the parchments. He looked them over word by word, line by line, wrapped them again in his silk kerchief, kissed them, and put them in his breast pocket. He remained silent for a moment, and then he said, "Everyone, keep this confidential. Let no one say a word about this to anyone. I want each and every one of you present here to get ready to accompany me on a visit to my saintly brother in Potik, where he lives. We will leave him Yirtzeh Hashem on the day after Chanukah." When the Sadegeret Rebbe arrived in Potik in the company of that group of Hasidim, Reb David Moshe went out to meet his brother and welcomed him with respect and affection. The two saintly brothers embraced and kissed each other. It was altogether a happy occasion for all. The following morning, Reb David Moshe took his brother into his private room, where they were going to daven together. On the table lay 3 pairs of tefillin next to each other. They were the Rashi's, Rabbeinu Tam's, and there was Shimusha Rabba as well. By the way, the Rebbe used to put on 4 tefillin, the Ravid's tefillin, but to put on these more than Rashi and Rabbeinu Tam, you have to be very, very holy and special and saintly. So he had those 3 tefillin next to it, and a little removed from them was another pair of tefillin in a bag, which the Sadegeret Rebbe recognized at once. This was the Maggid's tefillin, which their saintly father used to put on. The Sadegeret Rebbe observed his brother as he took out the Maggid's tefillin out of the bag. He held it in both hands, closing his eyes in reverent contemplation. After a moment, he sighed deeply and put the bag down on the table. Then he took his own pair of Rashi's tefillin, put them on and began to daven. Eventually, he also put on the other 2 pairs of tefillin in turn, as did his older brother, in accordance with their custom. After they finished davening, the Sadigerer Rebbe asked his brother, "Why didn't you put on our father's tefillin, the saintly Maggid's tefillin, which you have the schus to inherit?" Reb David Moshe replied, "What should I tell you, dear brother? It has been quite some time since I put them on. One morning, as I picked them up to put them on, I had a strange feeling. I did not feel their usual holy influence, as if their holiness had departed, chas v'sholom, God forbid. This could only mean one thing. For some reason, I am no longer worthy to put on these holy tefillin. I have searched my heart. I have prayed, to no avail. I truly don't know where I have failed or what I have to do to make amends, to feel the holiness of the Maggid's tefillin once again." Tears filled his eyes as he spoke these words. Then he quickly composed himself, and he said quite cheerfully to his older brother, "Everything is b'hashgacha pratis, by divine providence. Since you came to visit me so unexpectedly and brought me so much joy and honor, I want you to have these tefillin. You are certainly worthier than I. I am sure you will feel the holiness once again. I give them to you wholeheartedly." The Sadigerer Rebbe said, "Please don't, dear brother. Don't be so hasty, chap nicht, to part with this holy inheritance. You are blaming yourself without cause. There is no one in the world more worthy than you to put on the sacred tefillin of our great-grandfathers, the saintly Maggid. Let me tell you what actually happened and why you're not feeling the holiness anymore." And when he finished speaking, he brought out the sacred parchments and gave them to him, saying, "I have checked them carefully. They are as perfect as when they were first inscribed. Replace them into their batim, into their boxes, and I assure you that you will again feel the influence and inspiration that you had once felt flowing from them." Reb David Moshe was overwhelmed with an inner happiness. It could never be expressed in words, but for that matter, nor are words necessary. From then on, Reb David Moshe would put on those tefillin every day, but he had a special safe, a lock and key made, and that's where he would keep those sacred tefillin after he finished davening, so that no harm could come to them in the future. Soon afterwards, he moved to Charkov. He became famous as the Charkover Rebbe, with many Hasidim of his own. When he felt that the day approached on which he was to return his soul to heaven, he called in his only son, Rabbi Yisrael, and told him that he was leaving the Maggid's tefillin to him as an inheritance, and that he should know how to cherish them and guard them. Rabbi Yisrael Charkover was so concerned about the safety of the tefillin that he didn't dare to use them every day. He would only put them on twice a year, on Purim and Erev Yom Kippur. On all other days, he used his own tefillin. But despite his great care, the tefillin did get lost one day. This happened during the First World War. The saintly Rabbi Yisrael and his family had to leave their home in Charkov in great haste. Before the Russian Cossacks occupied the town, in the terrible rush of the sudden evacuation, the tefillin were left in the house. Rabbi Yisrael Charkover was terribly heartbroken, but there was nothing he could do. He and his family found refuge in Lvov, in Lemberg, hoping that the Austrian army would soon drive the Russians out of Galicia, and it would be possible to return to Charkov. But this was not to be so soon. The Russians swept through Galicia, taking one town after another. Everywhere, the wild Cossack ransacked the abandoned homes and set the houses on fire. When the Russians threatened Lvov, Rabbi Yisrael Charkover moved to Vienna to await the end of the war there. Several years later, the Russians were driven out of Galicia and Charkov was finally liberated. Rabbi Yisrael immediately sent a special messenger to find out whether it would be possible for him to return to the town and perhaps to find the sacred Maggid's tefillin in the ruins of his house. The report that the messenger brought back was disheartening. One day after the war, Rabbi Yisrael had an unexpected visitor. He was a Jew dressed in a tattered Russian military uniform. He had been a prisoner of war. The Charkover Rebbe could hardly believe his eyes when the soldier took out a pair of tefillin from his bag and handed it to the Rebbe. The Rebbe's eyes welled up with joyful tears. Here were the holy Maggid's tefillin, just as he had last seen them on the day before Yom Kippur 4 years earlier. Lovingly, the Rebbe took the tefillin into his trembling hands, kissed them, caressed them, just as if a lost child had turned up well and happy. Finally, he said, "I've always had the feeling that these tefillin will one day return to me. You truly have the great, great mitzvah of Hashavas Aveda. But tell me, where did you find these tefillin?" The soldier began, and he said, "It's a long story, Rebbe. I'll try and make it short. When the war broke out, I was serving in the Russian army and was sent to the front at the Austrian border. We fought many bloody battles, winning some, losing others, now taking over some border towns and villages, now losing them. Then we received reinforcements and were ordered to advance. The Austrians retreated. We were fast on their heels. When we reached Charkov, it had already been taken by another Russian brigade. I had been to Charkov before in my boyhood days because my father of blessed memory was a chassid of the Charkov Rebbe. He took me with him on several occasions when he went to his Rebbe. I was very much impressed with the Rebbe's spacious home in Beis HaMedrash and with the saintly Rebbe and his chassidim. But now, sadly, I found Charkov in ruins. Soldiers prowled the streets, coming out of abandoned houses, searching for any valuables. As I walked the streets, I suddenly came to a large mansion that was partly destroyed. It had attracted quite a few soldiers and civilians, some of whom were carrying out damaged kitchen utensils, pieces of broken furniture, and the like. I recognized the building, the Rebbe's house. I felt a deep pain in my heart. I walked inside from room to room, which lay bare and gutted, with piles of rubbish here and there. I came into one room and felt a strange sensation, as if I were in a holy place, though it was littered with rubble. Impulsively, I began to search amid the rubble, and lo and behold, I found this tefillin bag covered with dust, but otherwise seemingly untouched. I put it in my coat pocket and walked out. Needless to say, continued the soldier, I guarded the tefillin as the apple of my eye. But to be honest, I am sure more than I guarded the tefillin, these holy tefillin guarded me throughout the long war years. Many a time, under heavy fire, I clutched the tefillin to my heart and miraculously came out unharmed. Towards the end of the war, I was taken prisoner by the Austrians, and I was held in a prisoner of war camp near the Italian border. When the war was over, I was released. I am now on my way home. But first, I wanted to return the tefillin to the Rebbe. When I found out that the Rebbe was here in Vienna, I brought them here at once. The Rebbe was deeply moved and said, I cannot thank you enough, nor reward you for the great mitzvah you did. Only God Almighty can generously reward you for it. But for the great pleasure you brought me, I am very grateful. I ask you, please, would you be my guest for a few days and rest up for your long journey? We have a Pudyon Shvuyim fund, so you'll be able to get yourself some new clothes, throw away your tattered military uniforms, and as with other POWs, you will not leave empty-handed when you return to your home and family. Now, please excuse me for a moment. Having said this, the Rebbe went into the adjoining room where he kept the money. When he returned, the soldier was gone, nowhere to be found. The Rebbe called in his gabbai, who was sitting outside the rooms, and he said, please, quickly, go after him and bring him back. The gabbai asked astonishedly, after whom? Who are you talking about? I didn't see anyone here. The guy, that man dressed in a worn-out soldier's uniform. Didn't you see him leave a moment ago? The gabbai said, no, Rebbe, I saw no one leave. The saintly Rebbe said thoughtfully, well, never mind. That is the story of the Charkovist Tefillin, but I would just like to add one thing to it. And that is, interestingly enough, the Charkover Rebbe, as I mentioned, lived in Vienna. And in that time, there was also the Sadeger Rebbe who lived in Vienna, as I mentioned. And on Wednesday, the 4th of Tammuz in 1980, the Sadeger Rebbe visited our Rebbe. And the Rebbe asked him, in Vienna, there was your grandfather? And the Sadeger said, that my father and my uncle were there. So he said, was your uncle older than your father? And the Rebbe said, the previous Rebbe, when he went to Vienna, he met with the Sadegera Rebbe, and he asks him, what year was that? The Rebbe answers in 1938. And the Sadegera Rebbe says, that was my uncle, Rebbe Avram Yaakov. And then the Rebbe asks him, there's a famous treasure called the Geniza HaChersonis, which is printed in the famous Sefer HaTomim, all these letters of the Baal Shem Tov and other tzaddikim. And he asks him, did your uncle have the Geniza Chersonis? Because that's what they discussed. The previous Rebbe discussed it with your uncle. And the Sadegera Rebbe answers, that Geniza Chersonis was actually at the Charkova Rebbe, who we just mentioned. And he asks, is it still around? He says, I don't know for sure, but I do know that we have a letter from the Holy Rizhiner, and there's a letter from Reb Gershon Kitover. Now, the Sadegera moved to Tel Aviv, actually, and the Rebbe has a long talk with him about staying in Tel Aviv, even though the Sadegera wanted to move to Bnei Brak, which was where his yeshiva was, and many other things. And the Rebbe said he feels that Tel Aviv, Bnei Brak, has plenty of from Judaism, and he should stay really in Tel Aviv. Just quite a fascinating thing. Now, in the remaining 10 minutes or so, I'd like to share with you one other story of Reb Nochem Chernobler. Reb Nochem Chernobler lived in the years 1730 to 1798. He was a student of the Baal Shem Tov. He was 30 when the Baal Shem Tov passed away, and he also was a student of the Mizritche Maggid. And in 1773, he brought out his own Hasidic court in Chernobyl, founded on the pillars of humility and sincerity. When he passed away, he was succeeded by his son, Reb Mordechai Chernobler. He wrote a sefer called Me'or Einayim, the light of the eyes. And Chernobyl, sadly, was the site of the nuclear explosion in Russia, as people may remember. And Rabbi Yossi Reichik was very involved with bringing children out of Chernobyl. And when that nuclear disaster happened, there were so many worries about what is going to take place as an effect and what the reaction will be throughout the world. The worries were terrible. And when the Rebbe was asked about it, he said, the schus of the Me'or Einayim of Reb Nochem Chernobler will be over there. And we saw the great merit of Reb Nochem Chernobler, because the whole outcome of that disaster wasn't as terrible as expected. One of the teachings that he taught was, he said, many people wonder, why do we all have such different fates? Why are some people wealthy? Some are poor. Some have blissful home lives. Others struggle with shalom bayis. There are health issues that some have to deal with and others don't. Why is that? And Reb Nochem Chernobler taught that the purpose of life is to recognize God, and to facilitate that goal, God provides each individual with the circumstances that will help them attain that awareness. For some, it seems it is easier to discover God when wealthy. Others find him more easily when they struggle with poverty. Some have wisdom, some strength, some wealth, some poverty. This is all because God sees with his wisdom what each person needs, that this person needs specifically that situation in order to come close to him. Others have other life experiences because those are the experiences they need to become close to him. Although many of the Reb Nachum Chernobyl's teachings are based on the lessons he learned from his masters, the Baal Shem Tov and the Mizritcha Maggid, this particular lesson he had seen from his own life experiences, even before hearing it from his teachers. Reb Nachum sadly had a traumatic childhood, continued to suffer many hardships throughout his life. As a young child, he was orphaned of both his parents and subsequently raised by his impoverished aunt and uncle. Being an orphan is one tragedy. Poverty is another tragedy. And to top it off, he was also terribly mistreated. Once his aunt served toast and cream to her own children, but to little Nachum, she gave plain, dry toast. Nachum complained he also wanted cream, and for that, his aunt punished him and locked him up in a room. There was a bucket in that room filled with white paste. Nachum thought it was cheese. He put it on his toast. He couldn't eat his toast because that white spread was actually cement. Destroyed that toast. He later said that experience taught me that when one takes something that isn't his, he ends up losing that which is his. His aunt and uncle sometimes gave gifts to their children, such as a penknife, a watch. They never gave anything to Nachum. Somehow, however, Nachum always attained the same items as his cousins. The teacher at school suspected that he was stealing. How else did he get it? When he spoke to Nachum with it, Nachum said, "My father gives it to me." Teacher was astonished. "What are you talking about? Are you imagining things? You don't even have a father." He said, "I wasn't referring to my biological father. I meant my Father in heaven gives me these gifts. I ask and he gives me." Didn't sound right to the teacher. He shared his suspicions with the uncle. They decided to test it. The uncle gave a coin to each of his own children, but gave nothing to Nachum. Nachum ran to the shul. The uncle and teacher followed stealthily behind. They watched as Nachum put his head into the Aron Kodesh and sobbed. He said, "Father in heaven, I also want a coin. I want a coin just like my cousins have." He repeated his prayer many, many times, and suddenly they heard a coin drop. Nachum picked it up. His prayers were answered. This is a remarkable story of faith. It is certain that Nachum's unfortunate circumstances spurred him to enhance his connection with God, embodying the verse in Psalms, "Avi ve'imi azavuni," my father, my mother abandoned me, but God has brought me in. The Baal Shem Tov had heard about this holy young man and sent his students to ask Reb Nachum to come see him. Reb Nachum replied, "I work as a teacher. I have students and can't leave them Only when the Baal Shem Tov agreed to send a substitute teacher to fill in for him did Rab Nachum agree to accompany the students back to their master. He arrived while the Baal Shem Tov was eating a meal with his students, celebrating some kind of holiday. The Baal Shem Tov greeted Rab Nachum and invited him to join them at the meal. Rab Nachum stood there unsure how to proceed. It's not proper to eat a meal while wearing a coat. Neither did he want to take his coat off because his clothes were torn all around the shoulders. He was very poor. He couldn't afford to mend his clothes. He was fortunate he even owned his own coat. In fact, for a while, he and his wife, Sarah, shared a single coat, which they took turns wearing. The Baal Shem Tov repeated, "Wash your hands and join us at the meal," and that's what he did. The Baal Shem Tov invited Rab Nachum to be a guest in his home, and he warned his wife, "Beware of this man, he's a great ganef." After observing Rab Nachum's way, she asked her husband, "Why do you call him a ganef? He's a big tzaddik." The Baal Shem Tov said he wants to steal the entire Gan Eden for himself with his good deeds. Some say the Baal Shem Tov added, he wants to steal all the holy souls that are in heaven and have them as his descendants. Rab Nachum was hired as the Maggid of Chernobyl, and he taught Chassidus. His speeches were very highly effective, having the desired effect. When the Barditchever met a particularly humble person and asked him how he reached that level of humility, I heard Rab Nachum Chernobyl quote the Mishnah, said, "Be very humble." And it changed me permanently. Rab Nachum students wrote down what they heard, eventually culminating in a tremendous amount of handwritten pages, which they asked Rab Nachum permission to print. He chose 1/50th of the material. He said, "These are the lessons I don't remember teaching." That means it must have been the Shekhinah talking through me. I want to have those lessons printed. And finally, I finish with this one story of Rab Nachum Chernobyl. Rab Nachum heard about a city that couldn't afford to build a mikveh. He traveled there and announced, "Whoever pays to build this mikveh, I will sell him my portion in the world to come." In that city lived a wealthy person who never gave tzedakah. He realized this was a golden opportunity to earn his place in paradise in Gan Eden. He put down the money for the construction of the mikveh, plus more to pay for the heating of the mikveh for many years. Rab Nachum wrote up a document stating that he sells his portion of the world to come to the benefactor, and it was signed by witnesses. People asked Rab Nachum, "Why did you give away your eternal reward?" Rab Nachum explained, "This is my way of giving charity. I don't have much money. My only asset is my divine reward. So I gave that away for God's honor. This is how I fulfill the commandment in the Shema, to serve God b'chol me'edecha, with all your means." The truth is, Rab Nachum earned a nice salary serving as a maggid, but nevertheless, he and his wife were always poor because he gave most of his money to the destitute. In particular, Rab Nachum excelled at the mitzvah of Pidyon Shvuyim, raising money to release people from prison. Rab Nachum himself was imprisoned for a prolonged period for being a Jew. Many of his followers were surprised that his merits of saving people from jail didn't protect him. Rab Nachum explained the imprisonment was for his own benefit, because now that he knows how painful it is to be a prisoner, he will perform the mitzvah of Pidyon Shvuim in an even greater way. And as I said, the final story is how much he loved Shabbos. One occasion, he woke up in the middle of the night on Shabbos, wanted to leave the house. Everywhere was dark, and he was forced to grope in the darkness. He asked his host, "Why didn't you prepare tall candles that would last throughout the night?" His host was stunned. There were tall lit candles in the home. The home was well lit up. Yet they later discovered that the candle had been blown out, and the non-Jewish maid had relit it. Since the flame was lit on Shabbos, Reb Nachum was unable to see the light. When he was in his late 60s, he was hit by a running animal, never recovered from his injuries. He was forced to borrow money to pay the doctors. His colleague, the Alter Rebbe, the founder of the Chabad movement, who was very close to him, raised money to help him pay off his debts. Reb Nachum passed away on 11th of Cheshvan, 1797, leaving behind a wealth of inspiration, good deeds, and teachings that continue to nourish the soul. Schus hayogan aleinu, may the schus of all these tzaddikim stand by us. May their Torahs help us bring Mashiach. Shkoyach, thank you, and a good fach. Thank you, Rabbi Masinta.
Rabbi Kolaba, thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you.
Wish everybody a good vach. That was Koshel Bracha, the Rebbe, in 1967. Good evening, everybody. Good vach.